Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay, and every week we will be discussing topics in the wine world. Hello and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. Every week, myself and my co-host Mark, we discuss trending topics in the wine world, and we like to figure out what we've been paying attention to and Googling in the past week. So, Mark, what'd you Google?
Well, Kim, I was looking up a medieval unit of measure called a butt. B-U-T-T.
I talked about this yesterday with my husband.
I know you do a lot of history, so I always say the term butt, and I'm always thinking it's a huge barrel. I wanted to know what you converted to in volume. So
how much is a butt of wine?
Wine is 475 liters or 126 gallons, or as it was said in medieval times, 108 imperial gallons.
Okay.
Or 12 American gallons. So I was kind of...
Wait a minute. So it's 12 American gallons?
It said the imperial gallon. This is where it's confusing.
Yeah.
Imperial gallons of 108 was the equivalent of 12 American gallons, but then it said it's 475 liters or 126 gallons. So have you ever seen the actual gallon thing to... If you go by liters, it's definitely 126. So
yeah.
I don't know.
I think that there's a typo there for their American gallons, maybe.
That's Google.
Interesting.
Steer me wrong, but it's an Italian and a French term. So
yes. And it's actually the same root word as we get the word bottle from, believe it or not.
That's the Italian...
Yes.
Connection, correct?
Yep. And actually, my husband said this yesterday, that he was looking up what a buttery was. He's like, "What do you know what they store in a buttery?" And I'm like, "Butter."
Buttery is a person in wine, right? Like a butler.
And I think it's all connected language-wise. So a buttery could be a place to store beer and also wine.
That's funny. When I first was looking for a Twitter handle for wine education, I searched Buttery. And it was taken.
And isn't there, there's
taken.
a company that does wine delivery that's called Buttery, isn't there?
Yes, it was an app at one time, I believe, yeah. So what did you Google, Kim?
So I actually Googled a product that is in your store. I was looking up some information about Franciacorta, which is sparkling wine from Italy that is not Prosecco. It is more closely related to Champagne. So it is Italy's answer to Champagne. It's made from Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It's made in the same method as Champagne. Sometimes it has a little bit of a golden color and sort of a toasty, biscuity flavor. And when you serve it side by side with Champagne, it really does stand up to it. And it's absolutely delicious. So I wanted to know a little bit more information about Franciacorta.
And I'm so happy the bubbly queen mentioned Franciacorta because this is a phenomenal sparkling wine.
Oh, so good. So a topic from our friends over at Wine Folly, and a question that we get frequently about wines that are blends. And why would you blend a wine? Why wouldn't you just stick with all of the same grape in that wine? And there are reasons behind why a winemaker may choose to blend a number of different grapes together and make a new type of wine product. Bet you have a lot of blends on your shelves, don't you?
Yeah. We covered I was trying to think back how many episodes we've talked about how red blends are popular. We talked about Bordeaux blends. And
how white blends are not popular unless you're talking about sparkling wine.
But still a blend. And how sparkling champagne is a blend. So one of the things I think people should know is that a blend of wine, it can be the grapes, it can be the vineyards that they blend, it can be the vintages that they blend, it can be the barrels that they're blending. So it's more than just the grapes they're blending. It's a variety of things it can be. And one of the things in the past we always talk about too, Kim, is when you see on a label, if it says the grape, it only has to be 75% of that grape typically in the United States or 85% in Europe. So most wines are a blend. And people don't realize that.
Right. And we make a point, and especially when we're writing tasting notes or when we're writing something for a list or some sort of educational thing, we make a point, if it is 100%, to say 100%. Because if we see that it just says a grape variety, we are never convinced that it is all of that grape variety. So we really do look for that 100% marker if we're looking at a tech sheet or a tasting note that's put out by a winery or put out by some other wine professional. We really do pay attention to that because it can influence the flavor of the wine. If you have a grape variety like Pinot Noir that is light and delicate, if you're only required by law to put 75% of that grape in the bottle, you can muscle that thing up with 25% of something else and really change the style and the character of that wine. So especially for something like Pinot, we pay a lot of attention to that.
I'm so glad you mentioned this point because I get that feedback so much that, so you're talking Pinot, in the Pinot section, I'll put this is only 75% Pinot, so it's heavy, and people say, well, it's a Pinot Noir. Well, there's a big difference between the one that's 75% and the one that's 100%. So I get the feedback that way, but for me, I know the style right away to recommend it. The other thing that I'll do is I'll put it's 99% Cab, it's 1% Petit Verdot.
do you even go to that?
Yeah,
that type
and people
of level?
will say, because if I say it's 100%, I want to make sure it's 100%. So if it has 1% Petit Verdot, it does make a little difference to the wine. It might be a little darker in color or have something flavor profile from that Petit Verdot, but people think, they don't. Why do I care about that?
Yeah, I like thinking of it like a recipe. When
Exactly.
winemakers are putting together their final cuvee, their final blend for their wine, yes, there's the science of winemaking, but there's a little bit of art that goes into it too. If you add, a pinch of this and a smidge of that, and you're deciding what barrels to use, there's this feeling of it, and you really, for the best ones, get to experiment a little bit and really be creative. So I think that is where the art of blending really comes in. You might have, like you said, a lot of that Cabernet or that Merlot, but then maybe you have a little Malbec or you have a little Petit Verdot or you have a little Cabernet Franc. That winemaker can use those other grape varieties to really change the character and make that wine better than it could be. You're filling out sort of maybe the holes that only Cabernet would have had or only Merlot would have had. So I actually think that looking for a wine that is a little bit of a blend can be a bit of a better wine, even though sometimes people think that a blend is an inferior style of wine. That's not necessarily the case.
That is an excellent reference. I'm going to steal that. Instead of saying...
Which one?
Instead of saying blend, I'll say this is a recipe of 99% Cab, 1% Cab Franc. I think that is a great way to look at it because, we recently heard a story. We had a South African tasting, and it was like, what was it, Chenin and something else. There was a weird grape in the wine, and we said to the gentleman, why is he putting this in? He said, well, one of his friends called him. He harvested his grapes. No one would buy it. So the buddy said, you know what? I'll take it from him. I know you grow good grapes, and I'll find a way to put it in my recipe or my blend. And he did, and the wine was perfect. Mm-hmm. And he worked it in. So like they mentioned the article, and you mentioned, Kim, it is such an art that you can do something like that. Take someone else's totally different grapes, put it in, and still have your style that you like. So I love that. I'm going to steal that.
All right.
It's like your banana tannin things. I'm going to steal that one too.
Yep. If you want to sound smart when you're talking about wine, use the word blend. I hear oftentimes beginner wine drinkers will use the word mix. Is it a mix?
It's not paint.
It's not paint. You can use mix if you're making sangria.
Yes.
That works, or a cocktail. But otherwise, do use the term blend because that is the appropriate term to use, and you'll sound a whole lot smarter.
And we mentioned, Kim, a blend is a house style. So tell our listeners, when you talk house style, what are we really referring to in the wine world that this comes up a lot?
And we're back to my bubbles. So we're back to champagne. But often, we see this with Bordeaux a bit too. Was champagne the answer you were looking for?
Yes. Well, you're the bubbly. Okay. You have to promote you for that. So
right. So for champagne, they're the master blenders of champagne. But not only are they blending different grape varieties, but they're blending different vintages. So their whole point is very different from what you find in other parts, especially of France, where you get what you get in a particular vintage, and if one year is vastly different from another year because of the weather that particular year, you sort of like, yeah, this is what we do. This is our philosophy. We take what Mother Nature throws at us. Champagne doesn't really like to do that. They are so much more about the branding of their wines and then the marketing of their wines that they are trying to make a consistent house style year in and year out. So I like to use the example of Veuve Clicquot. Orangey yellow bottle of champagne that is very familiar to a lot of people. They want it to be that if you buy a bottle of Veuve Clicquot in the year 2005 and you drink it and you really love it, and then 10 years later you buy another bottle of Veuve Clicquot in that same yellow packaging, they want that wine to taste exactly the same as the one that you had 10 years ago, because they have a following of people who like what their wine tastes like. So just like maybe you're a Coke drinker and not a Pepsi drinker, maybe you're a Clicquot drinker and not a Moet drinker, and that's what they're looking for.
So the house style is actually a house recipe.
It's a house recipe.
I like that one even better.
So we're gonna keep using the word that they use is the cuvee, but I think if we go with recipe, that makes us sound a little more homey.
Here's where I want to go now, Kim. Here's where I want to go now. Thinking about blends and styles. You had mentioned in the past about Kendall Jackson. Kendall Jackson's Chardonnay, the 2008 vintage, does it not taste the same in the 2017 vintage that it did in the 2008 vintage to you?
They're trying to do that.
So the brands...
Absolutely. Those big brands...
are actually styles or recipes.
Yes, recipes.
But they're not considered blends. But when we were talking earlier in this article, a blend is from regions, from vineyards. That's what they're doing. Every vintage, they're blending to create a style or a recipe.
Because I think when the consumer thinks about a blend of wine, they are thinking about the grape varieties. They're not necessarily thinking about regional differences, because regional differences, I don't think, have the impact in the imagination of the wine drinker than different grape varieties do. You can sort of wrap your head around the idea that Merlot tastes like this, Cabernet tastes like this, Pinot Noir tastes like this. It is much harder for the everyday wine consumer to think that this place tastes this way and then this other place tastes this way.
It's like so I like this whole thing about the blends, and I'm thinking, Kim, that there is a sort of conspiracy in the blending world with blending. Not we talk about the big brands, but they do blend. When there's years they don't have enough grape sourced from California, they'll then change it to Chile or whatever. So it is blending at a huge level. And I'm so glad in this article that they mentioned there's all different forms of it. So then she mentioned, and you mentioned it earlier, there are some famous blends in the wine world. We talked about Bordeaux. It's always a blend of 5 grapes, and depending on harvest, the house style depends on how one grape or the other grows that year. They mentioned Rhone blends. Mm-hmm. You want to talk a little about what they call GSM blends in Rhone?
So Rhone blends generally are a blend of a number of different grapes, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes a whole lot more, especially in places like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, where they have dozens of grape varieties that they can put in the blend. You will sometimes see producers that make a point of saying, yes, our wine is all Grenache or our wine is all Syrah, but oftentimes they will use the major grapes of the area, and depending on what they grow more of or what flavor profiles they like, they'll use more or less of a particular grape variety. So usually it's a lot of Grenache, but there will usually be some Mourvedre in there, some Syrah in there. There's another grape variety called Cinsault that sometimes is thrown in there, but usually the big 3 are Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre. So you'll see that people will abbreviate that to GSM, and not just in the Rhone. Like, this is a style that has translated very well into Australia. So you'll see a lot of Australian blends of this type. And in California too, it was very, very popular. About 20 years ago, there were a lot of people, they call them the Rhone Rangers, who were making these Rhone style blends.
And typically if you see a blend and it's listing the grapes somewhere, usually it's from the most used to the least used. So if it says GSM, usually there's more Grenache than Syrah, more Syrah than Mourvedre. So it's kind of a tip for wine buying. One of the other famous blends in the wine world they mentioned was Super Tuscan from Italy, and we talked about this in the past. Super Tuscan has no real official term, but it's usually a blend of something, usually Sangiovese, Cab Merlot. They mentioned Washington State with CMS blends, and we talked about Washington State in another episode. Have you seen a lot of CMS
Definitely
brands?
From Washington. Yeah, I don't think they're as popular now as they used to be, but those are another blend that's based on Cabernet and then has other things in the blend. So the CSM would be Cab Syrah, Merlot.
First time I saw that was I just saw a big CMS on the label, and I thought that was the winery. You know, years and years ago, there was one brand. That was their big thing they put on in huge letters.
I remember that. I do.
So the other 2 countries they mentioned for blending, Portugal. Portugal wines, they use the kitchen sink in their blends, and we can't even most of the time pronounce half the grapes, but they do blend a lot. In Greece, You mentioned in another episode how you Googled Greek grapes. They do a lot of blending as well.
Oh, that's interesting because I've seen a lot of single varietal, but maybe that kind of goes in with that. It's the majority of one grape variety, and then they blend in a little bit of those other things.
Type of thing.
Yeah,
I'm surprised
for making that recipe.
She didn't mention French like Alsace, which I thought
they do make blends.
They have field blends, which is kind of unusual in the wine world, but. Could you think of any other blends that maybe didn't mention, or any other points of blends?
There are some places in Spain that will do the blending, but did she mention Bordeaux? Like that's the big one.
The Bordeaux blend was the one.
Yeah,
the first one. So I mean, a lot of good information, and I learned a lot from you today, Kim. I hope the listeners.
Yeah, so don't be scared. Don't think it's an inferior product if it doesn't say that big Cabernet across the front. Blends are, I think, fun to explore. And, think of them like a chef's recipe instead of as something that is just being put together from a bunch of different barrels.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay, exploring all things wine with you. If you'd like to get more information about Kim, please go to her website at vinitaswineworks.com. If you'd like to get more information about myself, please go to franklinliquors.com. If you'd like to send us questions or comments, you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Next, we want to talk about an article we found in justdrinks.com. Why is wine getting more complicated in the age of simplicity?
I think this is a really good question to ask, and something that those of us in the industry really do need to think about, and kind of our disconnect between what we do and how we think about wine and the end consumer. I really do think that it's important for us to reflect upon these ideas.
Yes, one of the things they mentioned, Kim, was we're not just telling people, it's from Italy. We're saying it's from Tuscany. It's from this hillside. So are we giving out too much information? Do people really care about that information, specifically to the area it's from?
Right. I have always been of a way of thinking about wine in how does the end consumer use that information? Is it of value to them? And that's why I tend to focus more on the flavors of a wine and what a wine tastes like, and not necessarily about the specific sub-appellations or what is the soil type or all of those other things, which can go into the story of the wine. And I know that you, Mark, really like to talk about what's the story behind the wine. That wine does have romance, and that, people often are going to make up their mind about a wine based on what is the backstory of that wine. But, you start talking about soil types and people's eyes glaze over, because that is not useful information to the consumer. It's useful to some consumers. Some people really do get all excited about what is the mineral here, and is this limestone soil, or was it grown on clay? And with those people, we're perfectly happy to talk about soil. But I think for the vast majority of people, that stuff, they don't have a way to process it. It's not valuable information. It doesn't translate for them into the flavor in their glass.
So do you think that complicated is the same as geeky? Is it too
think
geeky
that the two are
related.
I think they can be related. I'm okay with doing the geeky stuff if we can make that information applicable to the consumer. But that's also confusing too, because, okay, who is the end user? Who is the consumer? We talk to a lot of different people. We certainly have a lot of different people come to our classes, come to my events. People might really want to know the ins and outs of that particular vintage or that particular location, but other people don't. So it is hard, because we do have often a wide variety of people that we're talking to all at the same time.
Overall, I think a lot of feedback I get is wine is confusing. Mm-hmm. Confusing equals complicated.
Yeah.
And to explain a lot of things, you have to get geeky about it. And so we, as educators, we need a starting point, and then you need to know where to get from simple to start getting into the complicated or
right.
the geeky
But we
stuff.
also don't want to dumb it down, because I think that there are levels of simplicity that you can try to bring to the table for people when talking about wine, but I don't think you want to make it dumb, because it is a complex product. There is a lot going on in there. You can appreciate it at its simplest level, or you can appreciate it at a more complex level. And I think that there's a difference between dumbing it down and simplifying. And other people disagree. Other people think that, well, if you make it too simple, then you're losing the magic of the wine. You're losing what makes this wine special. But I think that there are different levels. But I understand what they're saying about when the wine producers themselves are getting so specific about where this wine comes from, that does that mean that now everything is special and that, you're sort of losing your specialness if everyone is special, I guess. It's like The Incredibles.
Yeah. No, I think you do a great job. Like we were talking earlier about, blends and using recipe. You have to bring in terms and descriptors that make it simple for a complicated process. And I think a big example of that is when we do a tasting, you're saying, well, this is how you taste wine. And people look at you, I drink wine all the time, right? Why are you telling me I have to swirl it and smell it? I just want to taste it, right? But you have to explain there's a complicated system of how you're supposed to enjoy it, but you simplify it and saying, this is why we do it, and this is what you're smelling. And
well, this is when I tell people that there's a difference between tasting and drinking. And I'm not going to tell you how to drink your wine. What I am going to do is lead you through this tasting, which is a totally different thing.
Which I think is a thing where people say, well, that's so complicated, right? I taste it, I like it. Why do you like it? It's wine. I like it.
Right. Well,
right? So
and now we're going to
a very complicated.
No, I think that's different. If people don't need to be taught how to drink, but if you are interested in learning how to taste wine, we're the people to come to. But maybe you're not interested in that. But I figure if those 25 people are sitting in front of me because they have come to a wine tasting and not a wine guzzling, then they are there to learn. So then I'm going to put that information in front of them. I feel like now you're my audience that you want to know. So you've already taken that first step of wanting to know a little bit more. So yes, I'm going to try to make it so that it is not as complex or as complicated as it could be, depending on the knowledge level of the group in front of me. But you've already cross that first threshold of, yes, I want to learn more. Yes, I want to learn how to taste wine. So now I'm going to bring you through those 5 steps or so in wine tasting.
Kim, what do you think is, I don't know if I want to say simplest or complex for us. What do you think is the most simplest wine thing that is very complicated to explain?
Ooh, the simplest thing
that's hardest
to explain?
Wine process that you say it, we always say it in a simple way, but it's very complex. It's multi-stage.
Fermentation, definitely.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Wine making, the whole process is very complicated, but when we explain it, what do we say?
We try to say it in the simplest,
sugar, yeast,
right? Sugar, yeast eats sugar. It spits out alcohol, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of heat at its simplest form. And that is all consumers need.
Exactly.
So you don't need to know the 27 steps of fermentation that go on a chemical level.
Know the differences, how whites and reds and rosés and fortified. You just want to know it involves grapes.
But some people do want to know that. So I do get the question of, after I talk about fermentation and how that happens, and then people are like, well, wait, how is rosé made? Then people are curious and they want to know more. So then it's like, well, let me tell you about how rosé is different from red and how it's different from white. So then we take that next step. But I don't think I have ever had any of my classes where I need to go into the actual chemical transformation that happens during fermentation. Yeah, I agree.
And I think that's, when I was reading this article, that's kind of what I was thinking. Yeah, it's getting complicated that they want to give you more of this information. If you ever read tech notes, they're telling you details of the winemaking that a lot of people, and myself most of the time, I don't really care certain things.
And I think,
and I'm geeky, so I can see their point.
Another one that is similar for me is sweetness and tartness. When you're talking about sugar and you're talking about acid and how people perceive it. Some people, especially if you're looking at a tech sheet, they're actually giving you the level of acid that is in that wine. They're telling you the pH. They're telling you the actual residual sugar amount that's in there. I think for me, it's good to have that information because I know how to translate that into usable sensory data, I guess you could say, in my mind. But that doesn't work for most people because you don't know what 3.7 pH is supposed to taste like in a wine. So talking about sweetness versus acid and how those two things play together and how it makes the wine taste in your mouth, I think that's another really complicated subject subject that sometimes it's just simpler to tell people this wine is off dry. It has a little bit of sweetness to it. Or this is a dry, tart wine, but I'm not going to talk to you about levels of acidity in there. That is wine 301 instead of wine 101.
Perception of
Absolutely.
dry and sweet anyway.
Yep.
But I thought interesting too, Kim, in this, they did not mention a lot about tasting notes.
No.
Tasting notes to me has been the thing they're making more and more complicated when it's very simple. Tell me basically what it tastes like. Don't try to come up with writing terms to be a creative writer when you should just be a wine reviewer.
And this
right?
is always something that wine people argue about. When we get really into a wine, especially if it's a wine that is complex and has lots of layers and we're getting super pumped up about it, we want to write in a lot of detail about how we're perceiving that wine, the flavors and the aromas and the textures that we're getting out of that wine. But that's not necessarily going to translate very well to someone who isn't getting all of those flavors. So there's some people that will argue from how you're arguing it that we should keep it as simple as possible. And then there are people on the other side of it that are like, no way, I am going to put exactly what I'm getting in whatever, flowery terms I want to put. And then people can pull from that what they will. So that's another one that people like to argue about all the time.
Yeah, and that's like the wine 101, 201, 301. I'm tasting fruit, I'm tasting black fruits, I'm tasting cherry. You keep going on and on. So, but definitely it's something I think that should be simplified more in the wine world. Anything else you think too complex that should be simplified? I think we hit a lot of good ones I think listeners can relate to.
I think just the way that labels are written can be very, very confusing for consumers because there's a lot of information that a winemaker wants to get out onto that label. And sometimes they might be required by law to put that on the label. You might not be concerned about this wine came from this particular vineyard in this particular area. You might just be looking for a Chardonnay. But that producer is proud of the fact that their Chardonnay comes from this very specific place because for them, the winemaker, that site translates into higher quality. You as the consumer might not understand that. And, on a one-on-one case, you might get that. Like if you go to the winery and you taste that wine from that one place and you're there and you have all the feelings and all the emotions that come with being in that particular place, then you are going to translate that place into quality for you. But if you are looking at 25 Chardonnays and they all have slightly different place names and vineyard sites on them, that's just gobbledygook. That's not going to really make a whole lot of sense to you when you're standing in front of a shelf and you're trying to choose what to buy.
You know what I've seen lately, Kim, is exactly what you said. They highlight the sense of the place or the AVA, but instead of highlighting it as a location, they're using it in the brand name because I think they feel like it's simplified if the brand is actually the spot.
Are they allowed to do that?
So it's drawing attention to, I'm thinking you see it as the brand, you think, well, how did they come up with that, right? And then you research, it's a new AVA. Or,
interesting.
So I've seen that on at least 2 or 3 brands where they say, this is a new AVA or new viticultural area. To highlight it, we're putting the AVA down, but we're also making it the trade name, in the trade name somehow.
Well, there is sort of a gray area sometimes between the name of the wine and the brand of the wine. And we see this with say, Bordeaux. There's a gajillion producers who make Bordeaux, but people understand that Bordeaux is a particular style. So sometimes it doesn't matter to the consumer who the producer is. It's, I want a bottle of Bordeaux or I want a bottle of Champagne. And the producer is sort of secondary. I want a bottle of Chianti. It's the Chianti that is important to people because they know that they have liked Chianti in the past. I want another bottle of Chianti. The producer is kind of secondary. So there is sort of this gray area, I feel, between some place names and this sort of idea of brand.
But it's simplified, so I think it's a good thing, right? If you want to get more complicated, you research it, right? Thank you for joining us today. We've been your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. You can find our past episodes on iTunes or SoundCloud, and you can send us questions or comments on our Facebook page, The Wonderful World of Wine. Cheers.
Wine, wine, wine.